Hello, my name is Tom. I'm a Danish photographer and this is my channel. Welcome to my series, Photography from A to Z. And this episode, the first episode, is letter A, and it will be about the aperture. And as I said in my intro to this series, I'm trying to make it as simple as possible so most of you can understand the principle about the techniques I'm talking about in my series. And I also hope I can make them short so it won't be too long and too boring to watch my videos. Perhaps you first started photographing and need to learn some basic about exposure and so on. And for you, it will be I hope it'll be a great video where you can learn a thing or two. Perhaps you have been photographing for a while, but still not quite sure about the aperture, what it means, what it can. And I hope you'll find this video interesting and perhaps learn something new in your photography. And on my camera, I changed the aperture on this ring that is on my lens. I can hear it, I can feel it. But most lenses nowadays doesn't have such a ring. So we have to find another place where you can change your aperture, and it's probably on top of your camera. And it's the same. I have this on top of my camera where I can change my shutter speeds. I can also hear and I can feel the clicks. But again, nowadays, many cameras doesn't have such a dial here. I can change the shutter speed. You can see most cameras look like this. So you have to find how you change the shutter speed. Many new cameras have a display here where you can see the aperture and the shutter speed. So you have to change it that way. I'll start beginning talking about the exposure. The aperture is very important for the exposure, so I'll start with this. You often hear that you should use the exposure triangle when you are exposing your picture. And for me, it's not the right way. It's making it more complicated than it has to be. You only have to consider the aperture and the shutter speed, in my opinion. Instead of using auto ISO on your camera, you should do like we did in the old days when we had film. The film had a certain speed, and when you put in the camera, you had the speed that you should use for a certain object. So on a bright sunny day, you can put your ISO for 100 and 200 ISO. On a gray, misty day, perhaps 400 to 800 ISO. And night photography or very dark places, you can use 1600 and upwards. So instead of using the exposure triangle, use the exposure scale. Here you only have to consider two things, the aperture and the shutter speed. The scale must always be in balance, that way you'll have the correct exposure. The beauty of the system, what do I mean by that? As I showed with the exposure scale, there's a system that works really great. Every time you're changing your aperture, it will double or halven the light that is coming in through your lens. And it's the same with the shutter speed. Every time you click one, it will either double or half the amount of light that is coming into your camera. So if you're changing your aperture from 5.6 to 2.0, you're letting 3 times more light coming through the lens, and therefore you shall reduce your shutter speed from 125 of a second to 1000 of a second. And if you're reducing the light that is coming through your lens 3 times from 5.6 to f16, you have to add 3 times more light through your shutter from 125 of a second to 115 of a second. So that's what I mean about the beauty of the system. It should always be in balance. So as you can see in this diagram, every one of these exposure will be in balance and perfect. And a good way to illustrate how the exposure work, if you imagine you are going to fill a bucket with water and you have a big hose that's a aperture of 1.8, then you have to turn on the water for some time. But if you have a smaller hose, aperture of 8, you have to turn it on a longer time to get the same amount of water into the buckets. And what is the aperture and how does it work? As you can see in this picture, the aperture is something that is inside your lens. At the f1.4, you have the most light coming through the lens into the camera, and at f.8 you can see the hole is much smaller, and thereby you'll have less light going through the lens into your camera. And for some people it's a little bit confusing that the higher the number, the lesser light come through the lens into the camera. But if you think about it like you learned in school about fraction, it's a little more clearly how it works. You can see here what I mean. The f2, you can see it's 1 out of 2, and then f8, it's 1 out of 8. So 1 out of 2 is more than 1 out of 8. And that means that you are reducing the light 4 times if you're changing your aperture from f2.0 to 8.0. And now for the next thing about the aperture, what is the depth of field? As you can see in this picture, the aperture also have an influence in how sharp your picture is. And if you think of it like this, you're standing on a field and looking out, taking your camera up and focusing on the rock, the big rock in the foreground. And if you're putting your aperture of 2.8, only the rock will be sharp in the foreground. If you're then changing your aperture from 2.8 to 8.0, more of your picture will be sharp. Deeper in the picture, in the field, will be sharp. And then if you are changing your aperture from 8 to 22, you can see more of your picture will be sharp, deeper in the field. So by telling you this, I hope you will have a better understanding in what depth of field means. And in this picture you can see how the sharpness is changing from f2.8 to f11. f11 gives you the more sharpness in the depth of field. You can also use the depth of field by choosing an aperture of 2.8 and then isolate an object from the background like in this picture. So to sum it up, the aperture not only reduce and increase the amount of light that is coming through your lens into your camera, it also have an influence on the depth of field, the area that is sharp in your picture. As you see here, that aperture of 1.4 is a very large aperture, very small depth of field, and almost nothing is in focus. And if you change your aperture to 5.6, a medium aperture, you have more depth in field and a larger part of your picture that is sharp and in focus. And lastly, if you change your aperture to f22, a very small aperture, a very large depth of field, and almost everything in your picture will be sharp and in focus. And remember, the best way to learn is to do it in practice. So go out, take your camera and do some tests and find out how the aperture works. This was my little video from my series Photographing from A to Z about aperture. And I hope you find it interesting, and then I hope to see you again on my next video. Bye bye.